you think are the most important trends in international education at the moment?
Well, obviously there are several factors, and I think there are factors that universities or business schools are sort of able to control, and other factors that they don't control. And for me, the most dangerous ones are the ones that they don't control. It means the ones which are set up by politicians, or let's say governments. And in the US, in Southeast Asia, in the Middle East, in Australia, you can see sometimes decisions which are taken not necessarily in accordance with the industry or what the industry would want, and that can have profound impacts on the industry. I mean, if we take the Australian example, you have what I consider, viewed from elsewhere, as an over-reliance on international students, on foreign fee-paying students. And obviously it can be very dangerous for the industry, because if suddenly your own minister decides on whatever new things, and I understood that it happened in the recent past, or for any other reasons, there is a clash with China, or a clash with India, all sorts of things happening, and if at the same time there is, let's say, for example, Europe opening more to these students, which is the case now, we see more and more Indian students, and we see more and more Chinese students, fee-paying students in Europe, particularly. I mean, you had traditionally in UK, but particularly in France and Germany, they are coming in relatively high numbers compared to before. There are, for example, at the moment around 15,000 Indian students in Germany, which is a relatively high number. Compared to Australia, it may not be, but it's really a relatively high number and a growing number. So at the same time, you've got political decisions, and then you've got trends also by the industry of being more open to certain categories of students, and then it can create a certain unbalance from a country to the benefit of another country or on another region. In general, what we see, and in relation to Australia, is that obviously there are more and more, parts of the world that were considered as being less developed in terms of higher education, which are obviously developing, which means that there is more and more choices for students to stay in their own country. And that's the case for Malaysia for many years. Alors, fortunately, in Malaysia, a few very good Australian institutions are there already, so they can benefit from students staying in Malaysia. Also, you still have the price gap, which can be an issue at some point compared to the national institutions. And Malaysia, with the change of government, that's a good example also of political influence, may mean that, for example, more Chinese Malaysians may be able to study in free public universities, which are getting more and more AACSB accredited, which starts to appear in the international rankings. So it means more choice at home. We see exactly the same in India at the moment, which for me from Dubai is really our neighbors, where there are more and more very good institutions, again, getting accreditations. We see that in the country I work in for the moment, in the UAE. The mandate set up by the minister is for all the institutions which are ministry accredited, public and private, to go for AACSB accreditation, for example. So all these are creating trends where it may be the competitive advantage that some countries had over others in terms of higher education and in terms of what's next may disappear. Typically, depending on the students, but we have seen basically students that would go abroad to study, to gain knowledge, because they thought that going abroad would be useful for them in terms of pure knowledge. Like Harvard is very good, so if I graduate from Harvard, it's great. Students that would go abroad a bit to study, but more for the intercultural experience, and that was the basis for the success of Erasmus in Europe. These millions of students traveling all over the place. Studies are more or less the same level anyway, that's another topic, but they would go there for the intercultural experience. And then you would have another category, a third category of students that would go to another country for a job/visa, or visa/job. which is partially the case in the UAE, for example, for us, for Indian students, and which for me is obviously the case for many foreign students in Australia. Often when I'm very direct with Australians, I tell them that they don't sell knowledge, they don't sell a degree, they sell a visa. And so, but it means that in front of that, you need to be able. Knowledge in some ways doesn't care. They don't care. I mean, what they want is a job, which means that what they want is a growing economy. And again, for example, to make a parallel with the UAE, in the UAE, in the very good years, we see an influx of students from India. In the less good years, suddenly they disappear. Because if they cannot find a job in the UAE, there is, with a policy on visa which is very different from Australia, but if they cannot find a job in the UAE, there is no financial point in investing into studying in the UAE, even for a very, very good institution. They better stay at home, where there are also very good institutions. So you see all this geopolitical phenomenon appearing at the same time, and to summarize, I mean, the main trend for me is that it's messier and messier, but that's the world in general. But I would tend to think that more and more students will stay at home or near home, because again the level of studies is increasing at home. We see the same thing starting to appear also in Africa. Obviously, students with lots of financial potential, I mean investment potential, they will always be, or I mean always be attracted by studying in UK, studying in Australia, studying in Paris, studying etc. etc. But this may become marginal, and the bulk of students who are particularly for under countries in transition or considered as being underdeveloped, the effort by the family of 10 family members paying to send one person somewhere, it may disappear, especially for mid-level quality institutions. Again, we can expect that Harvard and MIT and etc., but not everybody is accepted there also. Will remain as magnets, but for the bulk, it may become more and more difficult to attract these students.
So Australia, which has offered, yes, the work visas and a supposed lifestyle experience, how dangerous do you think the current environment is for Australia? I mean, are we particularly at risk?
Well, again, I follow what's happening in Australia, but less than all the members of ABDC. Australia always scared me, honestly. I mean, I'm scared for you. The history of internationalization in Australia was mostly a constrained one. I mean, if we go back to the start of why Australian institutions went abroad, is because they needed to go abroad because they did not have enough students in the country to sustain the development, etc. So you went abroad constrained, and then it became an industry. It is an industry, a very good one, but like many countries where you have industries where the size of the industry is very much disconnected with the size of the internal market, obviously you are very, very dependent on whatever is happening in the world. There are other countries like that, and there are other countries where the entire economy is dependent on the rest of the world. Small countries in general, that's our case in the UAE, Singapore, etc., etc. So that's why what always scares me is that I hope that you have behind that the correct business model to be able to react to. Well, you have seen that, maybe not by this magnitude, but suddenly having 50% less Indian students or 50% less Chinese students. But the difference could be that if it's for 1 year, it's okay. if it's for 10 or 20 years, it may jeopardize your entire investment policy in other activities, in research, and to become an important research center in many areas. That's why, in some ways, what some of the Australian institutions did, not all of them, but to go abroad and establish branch campuses with all the risk associated to that, with some amazing success and with some great failures that generally we forget about. It's a way to spread the risk. So in terms of institutions, I think it was a great idea.
The current anti-immigration mood in a number of countries, I mean, it's been growing here. There's been a lot of talk about population growth here, etc. recently. That sometimes seems to be completely at odds with the acceptance of, international education being our third biggest export. So, how much of that tension is playing out in other places around the world? I mean, how does that resolve itself?
Yeah. Well, I think in academia we are very much utopists. Most of us, we believe in a free, happy, peaceful world, and the reality is different. And when we are struck by reality, suddenly we realize, because, for example, this anti-immigration policy and issues that you have now in Australia, in Europe, and particularly as soon as we talk about skilled people, on the contrary, the more we can take, because it's another situation. Germany is aging very, very fast. Germany needs new young people, and it cannot get it. It won't get it from the people already in the country. So Germany needs immigrants. In some ways, France needs immigrants also. So there are many countries like this where you always need immigrants to fuel the development of the economy. And obviously, education is a great way, because with education you have skilled immigrants, and these countries being more and more toward activities and jobs with a certain added value, you need more and more skilled people and less, you still need plumbers, you will always need plumbers, but let's say factory workers, blue collars. You need less and less blue collars. So education is a great way to have in the country not blue collars coming, but more white collars, to make it brief. So anti-immigration policies, again, fortunately, so far they come and go, because they are still very dependent on the echo that the government will give to what the population think, or sometimes even a minority of the population would think. So governments, they come and go in many countries. So that's a good way to resolve that.
So that too, like everything else, is fluid.
Yeah.
You've worked in a number of business schools in a number of countries.
Yeah.
What do you see as the common shifts in the actual way business schools themselves are operating?
Yeah.
Are we moving more, changing radically in terms of teaching? Are we changing in terms of research? Where are the major shifts do you see?
Well, the major shifts that we have seen in the past 20 years, there are two. The most important one for business schools only is the importance of international accreditations, and particularly ACSB. And the fact that, 25 years ago, you still had, the way we were teaching and operating and dealing with students and dealing with companies in France was very, very different from UK, very, very different from Germany, from Australia, etc. And now with let's say ACSB that is now the norm, even for the non-accredited institutions, they would still follow many of the ACSB constraints, because that's becoming a norm. That's the point of a norm, and they plan to go for most of them. So ACSB and a bit EQUIS have made most of the business schools look alike in many areas, many areas. That's why, again, in terms of international students, if you go to a ACSB institution in India and one in Australia, what you will be taught in your MBA will certainly be more or less the same, with maybe even the same textbooks and the same case studies, and so the difference is elsewhere. You still have some difference in terms of interactions with companies. That's where between countries you would see differences. So in terms of trends for business schools, the other very important thing, but which is not at the moment affecting all of them, is the international rankings. Okay, Times Higher Education, Shanghai, QS, etc. What I'm saying that it's not affecting all of them is that because there is still a very strong size effect to be part of these rankings, most of the countries, I mean the countries where you will still have standalone business schools, is the case for France, is the case in India, etc. The QS rankings are almost out of reach. Not fully, because these people are not stupid. So
they need the research component.
Yeah, and there's a size effect. You need 100 of this and 1,000 of that, you know. So it's because of that, when you are not part of a university, it can be difficult to achieve these numbers. And also when you are in a country where the business school industry is fragmented, it's also more difficult to have a large. I mean, in France or even in the UAE and maybe even in India, maybe, but we don't have faculty of business with 17,000 students like you had, I don't know, Curtin a few years ago was this type of numbers. We don't have that. So international accreditations and international rankings make that, one, we look more and more alike, and two, we have to spend more and more on research.
To keep up the rankings.
To keep up with the rankings. Is research useful? Has been endless debate in business schools. I don't know. I have no answer to that. But that's the game at the moment. That's part of the game. So all the schools have to invest a lot, which means that it's a very different business model that they had to build. Less teacher-oriented, less full-time faculty-oriented, because full-time faculty, if you want them to spend time doing research, if you want them to spend time applying for research grants when it exists, if you want them to spend time to do international collaborations, because it is also more valued by the rankings, they have less time in the classroom. So you replace that by part-timers, which you have been, I think Australia has been is the best example. Yeah. You have been to the end of this model, and good for you. And so at some point, will the students start to feel that or not, that what they were looking for in terms of relation with their school is disappearing? Again, it also depends on what are your objectives when you go for a business degree. If it's just to get a piece of paper to get a visa, after all, as long as you get your piece of paper and then you get your visa, content is secondary.
But this obviously, and what you're saying from that there's almost an homogenization of the product that's been offered internationally. And does this mean that ultimately students, and obviously around the world, are going to suffer? Because if rankings are based on research and everybody wants good rankings, and as you said, does that mean that it actually opens another space altogether for the teaching-only schools?
Well, it could. Research, if it is well designed and if you pay attention, you can have very useful, still useful research in the classroom. I'm not saying that research is useless. Sometimes it's just that sometimes it's disconnected. The raw product is disconnected from the usefulness in the classroom or for employers. Sorry. So the question is, how you connect it again in terms of relevance in the classroom, and how do you make sure that your faculty, your researchers, they keep on doing this connection, a connection which, up to my knowledge, is for example much more direct in biology, in medicine. Okay, the connection between the practical world in medicine and the research world, is much clearer and is much closer. So in the case of business, we can see we all joke about examples of papers which are read by 5 people in the world, including 3 of the authors. So that's where there is something to do, because a teaching-only institution may first it's non-accredited, so in terms of competition, not easy.
Not as sellable. Yep.
No, yes, so it's less sellable, and again, it's supposed to be less up-to-date knowledge that is passed on to the students. This being said, the teaching-only or almost teaching-only model, for example, was the model in France 25 years ago, 30 years ago, with great success. Great success in terms of placement of students, great success in terms of the careers of the students. Because at the same time you have this disconnection or potential disconnection in terms of research, and then at the other end of the spectrum you have always these articles, even in Australia, about the students are not industry ready and degrees are useless and employers want something else, and etc. So they want something else, but at the same time you still need to offer what you offer. So you are in a bit of a schizophrenic situation. You need the basics of accounting and and marketing, but you need soft skills, but you need sustainability awareness, you need geopolitical awareness, you need to train them about mindfulness, you need to do all sorts of things like this. So at the end, I guess that business schools don't know anymore. Or there is a risk that they won't know anymore what to do. Accreditations are keeping them in a certain framework or in an enclosed playground, if you want. But there is this risk of not knowing what you need to do, and from an international perspective, not knowing what you need to do to differentiate yourselves from your competitors in other countries to keep on attracting international students.
And how much do you think this is going to be compounded by really a move more towards lifelong learning, where you don't just get your degree and set yourself up in a career for life? How much will that shift things over time, do you think?
It's very interesting. I'm a strong believer in lifelong learning. I'm a strong believer in alternative, in pedagogies where there would be all sorts of things in the classroom and new skills and etc. And at the same time, you see so many institutions where the main program, the most successful program, is the Bachelor in Accounting. Which is
a skill that's going to be automated a lot.
Yes. So we are talking about all these things, lifelong learning and and again I was joking about mindfulness and everything. But you've got parents and students, and in some ways employers, who want graduates with a Bachelor in Accounting. Okay.
It's concrete.
Yeah, it's very, very concrete and very immediate skill. So they want that. So you've got this disconnect, and then you've got another one which I have observed myself, is that in many countries, when the higher education industry or business school industry starts to develop, it starts with the Bachelor. And then, as soon as you are done with the Bachelor, you need a Master. Okay? And then, you need an executive MBA. And you need a DBA. And you which is good for the business, but I often joke, because when I worked in Malaysia, I realized that the same international companies were hiring for the same job at the same equivalent salary. In Malaysia, students with a Bachelor, whereas in France, you needed your Master, you needed your MBA. You would never have gotten the same job with only a Bachelor. Okay? So you got sometimes these weird things. To come back to lifelong learning, yes, I think it's. It has always been useful, and don't forget that business schools are ultimately professional schools. We are professional, like engineering. We are professional schools, or in some ways like the vocational schools. And in vocational schools or in vocational jobs, it's quite standard to remain in some ways always on top. An electrician needs to regularly be aware of what's new. First, the rules, regulation, norms, and laws, and whatever, obviously, but also what's new in terms of technologies and types of plugs and whatever. Because if you want to keep your customers to trust you to electrify their home or their buildings, you better come up with the best solution. So these people, just an example, they have been used to be lifelong trained and keep the awareness. Whereas us, at least in many countries, we had this idea that, we get a degree at 20 years old, 25, and then that's it. The question remains on what is needed. I will give you one very short example. One of my friend who has a high leadership position in a very successful company. So she's more than 45 years old. She decided last year to do an executive MBA in one of the top 5 business schools in Europe. She told me, it's very interesting. She told me, it was totally useless. We knew everything already, just we did not know that we knew. Mm-hmm. So coming into the classroom was just to realize that, okay, what this professor in whatever or organizational behavior or whatever is talking about, I knew already. I've done it already. I've lived it.
So it's formalizing what you know, right?
Yeah, it's formalizing. So she enjoyed she was happy for the whatever 100,000 euros she paid because of the networking, because of they went 1 week here, 1 week there, like you do for this type of program. So she was very happy for that. But in the classroom, she was unhappy. Again, it's a very specific case of executive MBAs, very expensive training. So it's a form of lifelong learning when you go for an executive MBA. So it means that lifelong learning, yes, but it should not be recycling what you teach to the bachelor students in another fancy format with whatever things happening on your screen, or and it has to be different to answer the needs of these people, which are different at 30, 40, 50 years old than they are at 20, 25 years old. But yes, I hope that it will take off. What I see, at least I've got 2 countries in mind, is that unfortunately the lifelong learning business, and including some of the MOOCs and things like this, is often taken by consultants. I think that there is a market for business schools that for some reason we are not taking, or we are not aggressive enough. And this market, you can see, one of the most obvious form is all the certificates you can get on LinkedIn, for example. Mm-hmm. So there is something where the consulting companies or companies which are not really connected with academia are taking a chunk of the market, whereas we should be the leaders in that.
Is that because business schools are traditionally centered in universities, which traditionally are not that agile?
Well, it can be part of the equation. There is a natural inertia in academia. We have to live with that. We are all into that anyway. I'm not blaming anybody, because I'm like that too. That's how we are in academia. So yes, there is a lack of agility, definitely, and also the same way there were many countries that were not internationally oriented in terms of student recruitment because they had enough with their own students. There are many institutions that have enough with their current degrees. So why looking at, extra money is always good, but it's an investment to maybe, make 1% of our budget extra on that. Okay, it's important, let's try. But it's not life or death for institutions at the moment to enter into lifelong learning.
Do you think it will become life or death?
New generation, there are all sorts of talks about millennials and etc. This being said, at the moment, again, we still see students and companies asking for a proper degree, generally gained full-time. So this business of full-time initial degrees seems to be here for quite a while. The business of MOOCs, for example, for business schools so far, or universities, I mean, the ones who are starting to make money with that, they are not directly, I mean, they are mostly private institutions, I mean, private organizations. So it's a bit difficult to see on this one how the world will evolve. We have had brick and mortar education institutions for now almost 2,000 years. So I think it will last for a few other.
It will survive.
Yeah, it will survive. It will survive me at least for sure. Yeah.